Hi, everyone. My name is Mary Harvey. I'm the CEO for the Center for Sport and Human Rights, and I'm here today with one of our directors and trustees, and now also the appointed CEO of the Global Observatory on Women, Sport, Physical Education, and Physical Activity, Dr. Payoshni Mitra. Welcome, Payoshni.
Thank you, Mary. It's a pleasure to be, speaking to you, and what occasion this is.
Exactly. Well, we just had International Women's Day, and there's a lot happening this month and this year. So we'll kick off with the Commission on the Status of Women, or CSW as it's sometimes called, which is the principal global intergovernmental body dedicated to the promotion of gender equality and the empowerment of women. Well, between March 14th and March 25th of this month, they'll be discussing two main themes. So the primary theme is advancing or achieving gender equality and empowerment of all women and girls in the context of climate change, environmental and disaster risk reduction, and so on and so forth. And we did a blog about this. So I'd love your thoughts on how you see that theme coming to life from your standpoint. And then also on the women's economic empowerment in the changing world of work. So this whole idea of, particularly in sport, how women as athletes and workers, what economic empowerment looks like. So I thought it'd be great to have a conversation with you on how you feel this applies to the world of sport. So my first question is, why do you think it's important to look at women's rights in sport from the perspective of work and labor rights?
I think, Mary, we need to first talk about the fact that we all celebrate International Women's Day, but we tend to forget where it all started. It started with women workers, and it was at some point of time known as International Working Women's Day. And I think that's key to today's discussion as well. The fact that we are working on sport today, we are talking about women in sport, but we often tend to not talk about women workers in sport and look at an athlete as a worker, but also look at all the other areas of work in sport where women are involved. And therefore, I feel it's so key that the two of us are talking about this issue today, especially the looking at sport from the workers' rights and labor rights perspective. It's absolutely crucial. And I'm so glad that the Center for Sport and Human Rights initiated this conversation.
Well, you bet. I mean, I remember 100 years ago when I was a player. I was a soccer player, football player. And I remember one of my teammates, it was 1993, I think, 94, and she was having her first baby and bringing up to our soccer federation this idea of simultaneously being a national team player and a working mother, right? So she's got, accommodations for somebody to help her when we were playing somewhere, right? This was all new, right? So this whole idea of maternity leave, pregnancy leave, what have you, but also just being able to work if you're an athlete and you're nursing. And if you're going to play somewhere, it's not so easy, right? You have to make change to keep up with it.
And the thing is, this is so true of many women playing sport today in different parts of the world, because laws have not changed in the same way, as we all know, in different parts of the world. And interestingly, I was speaking to a journalist from Pakistan last week after the captain of their cricket team walked into the stadium with a 6-month-old baby in her arms, and it became huge news, But the Pakistan Cricket Board apparently has very good, sort of very supportive policy for women who, for pregnant athletes as well as women after they give birth, which was interesting, and therefore she was traveling with her baby. But this isn't true of other nations playing cricket as well. So the very point of maternity related sort of policies isn't something that the sporting world has adopted sort of universally. We won't see this in other parts of the world. Interestingly, Pakistan has a very developed policy as far as this is concerned. And there are so many other issues in the context of an athlete. I remember sort of going to football, what we call football in some parts of the world. Maybe you just spoke about soccer. I have noticed how the playgrounds were not really meant for league matches in Bengal, in India, where I come from. And yet women were asked to play there and they had no other option. So they would play and get injured badly without any medical facilities available to them. And this would go on, and this is still going on. Things are changing slowly in certain parts of the world, a little faster in advanced nations, of course, but they are still not where the men's game is. The amount of support that male athletes receive from their federations, from the government, is way more than what we see in women's game even today. And whether it is the US or the Switzerland or India or South Africa, it is, there is a difference which hasn't been completely reduced. And that is something that we need to still discuss. Sorry, you're going, yeah.
Well, I was just going to say, so, I mean, I think that's a natural segue into talking about pay equity, right? So, you talked about distribution of resources. I mean, we know that women in general, I mean, pay equity is an issue. And in sport, because of the imbalance, there's a big pay disparity. And we've seen the lawsuit that was famously brought by the U.S. women's national soccer team, which was recently settled by U.S. soccer. But you're seeing probably more and more issues of pay disparity pop up in different parts of the world. What are your thoughts on the whole, pay equity challenge that women athletes, workers face in sport?
It reminds me of an article I was writing in 2009 for a women's sport magazine called Sports Sister, which was published in England. And I was asked to write about women's football. And I said, because the 2009 Euros were about to take place. And I called UEFA and called their media number. And I asked, so what's the amount of money that you have as prize money for the women's game? And they said, oh, interesting question. Let me take a look. Now, this can't happen today. This is from 2009, only
Right.
about 13 years back. And I held on to the phone for quite a long time, and this man comes back and tells me, well, we realized there is no prize money whatsoever. It's a prestigious event. There is a trophy. And that was the answer. Whereas I think about 184 million euros were spent for the men's event, as prize money. This is what was available to the women. They were just given a prestigious event to play in. And that brings us to what the fight of the women soccer players in the US and elsewhere in the world, where this still remains a question, as if we should be happy enough that we are allowed to play. We are not good enough to be paid. This is the notion, and I'm sure, Mary, when you played, for USA, when you represented your country, this must have been a huge question too. Did it occur to you in those days?
Well, I mean, I was lucky enough to be on a team that won the Women's World Cup, the first one, and I got a handshake, and said, thank you very much, welcome. And can I have your uniform back? And I just went, no, you can't have my uniform back. And they were good about the uniforms, but of course, it's a very different prospect. And I look at what the women now have achieved, at least in recognition that there is this massive pay disparity. And one of the things that you hear is sort of, well, the women's game isn't worth what the men's game is worth when it comes to economic, value. And I come back and say, well, if you've chronically underinvested in the development of a commercial asset, and therefore it's not worth necessarily as much as assets that have been invested in, is that a fair comparison? Right? So it's a circular argument, right?
Yeah.
And so I don't know what your thoughts are on that, but.
No, I completely agree with you, Mary. Men's football, I mean, even if you look at women's football's history, the history is broken because women were not allowed to play football for the longest time. I mean, in England, for example, FA banned football for so many years until the time, even though they played football during World War, after that, there was a long ban. So the women's football as a sport did not grow, and you would know better than I do. And even in the context of India, where I come from, there was a lot of football in the 1970s and 80s because a couple of football leaders, especially Aarti Banerjee, a woman married to a national sporting hero, P.K. Banerjee, who really took initiative to create a women's team in India. And we do have great players who represented Asian football team in those years, but then there was nothing that happened at the league level. So another point we need to talk about is the lack of competition. Now, nowadays we see at the international level, we have a parallel women's competition to almost every big event, but that's not the case while you are training as a footballer from your childhood. You don't have as many access to competition as a boy of your age does. So I think lack of competition, lack of infrastructure, you're always given the second-hand stuff, as you talked about the uniform, which you were asked to return. So many of us, we have heard, we were given loose shirts which belonged to the boys' team and were given to us. I personally, when I played for my university, I remember we qualified for a national at the regional level. The girls' team did, the boys' team didn't. And we were so happy about it. But only in a few days' time, we got to know that we were not going to go to the tournament, travel to that place at all, because the boys' team did not qualify. So the girls' team didn't matter at all for the university. So these kind of disparity, we have seen it at all levels. Now, the interesting thing, I think, today, when we look at sport, is not only about athletes, because the sport industry has become so complex. There are so many women who, thankfully, have made their way to administration, to leadership, to coaching, to refereeing, to umpiring, to all kinds of physiotherapy. There are all kinds of professions where women are involved. And what can we say about the rights of these women? For example, women journalists in India keep talking to me about the lack of toilets in stadia, where it makes it completely impossible for them to report on sport, and they end up choosing editorial work, desk job, just because the facilities are not good enough for women journalists. So and also obviously there is an atmosphere which is very, very sexist, to say the least. So we also need to talk about these other women in sport, which I feel is so important if we are talking about sport, as in general.
Well, it's about access also, right? If you don't have access, you can't do your job. And part of access is being able to get basic access to things like being able to use the bathroom. But in other cases, it's, areas, at least in the US a while back, there was an issue of male reporters being allowed into locker rooms to interview players. Women weren't. So therefore, women didn't have equal access in terms of opportunities as a worker, right? they weren't there, so they couldn't get the same stories and access to the same level of information as their male colleagues. And of course, they changed that. And then over time, it's changed yet again. But it's this whole idea of equal access in the workplace to opportunities. And then there's this whole challenge, particularly at the grassroots level, before they become, professional athletes, of access to facilities. I mean, for boys, and you know this, there's only a certain number of football pitches if you're looking at football or cricket or others. And in many parts of the world where there's access to that kind of facilities, the girls get access to it at a time of day that may not be safe for them, that may not be appropriate for whatever reason. And I mean, that's a whole barrier to access in and of itself.
Yeah. And also I think it especially if you are part of a team sport, it becomes even worse, because in team sports, it becomes really difficult for girls' teams to get access to the best possible infrastructure, because boys are always there. In individual sport, it's slightly different, because if you're really doing well and you have prospects, you might as well get a little bit of space and share space with the boys. But it's not the same when it comes to team sports. I completely agree with you that has been a huge challenge in most parts of the world, and also the timing at which they can access the place, whether it is safe at that time, whether it is dark. In certain parts of the world, it is also, in almost all parts of the world, it's also a safety issue. How can we make sure that we remove all these barriers to ensure that girls and women are receiving equal access and opportunities, as you just mentioned. Mary, I would really like to know about how unionization happened, and now we know that in football.
Well, this whole idea of collective voice, right?
Yeah.
So talk a little bit about, so we've seen, collective voice. Certainly the team I came from 100 years ago had collective voice. We didn't have a union. Later, there was a union. And before there was a union, there was this collective voice, many as one, to say, this is what we need. We're now seeing more and more examples of women either unionizing or coming together, and to deal with not only pay disparity, but cases of really egregious abuse, like sexual abuse and harassment. And we've seen it all over the world. So in your work with athletes, that are seeking remedy for situations that are pretty egregious, can you talk a little bit about why, looking at them as workers with collective voice and unionization, how that's made a difference?
To be fair, I have mostly worked with athletes from individual sport. And also, if you look at sport at the high performance level, what happens is you are focused on sort of a personal, individual pursuit. You are focused on achieving excellence, and you are just focused on yourself. It often escapes the athlete's mind that there is a need to connect with other athletes when you are so training individually, often not in a team, because you are in something that you are sort of an athlete, a track and field athlete. And therefore, it has been even harder to sort of give these athletes a sense of a collective. There's obviously that notion of a nation that brings athletes come together when we have an Olympics or a game where they're representing the country. But it's not something that you would see at the day-to-day level, which is why I found when I worked with athletes with high level of testosterone, and I worked with Duty Chand, I've worked with Annette Negisa, I've also been part of Caster Semenya's case, and it has been not so easy to explain why there was a need to connect with other athletes or to understand each other's sort of issues. Having said that, all three athletes I mentioned ended up doing a bit more than what was needed for their particular cases. and it came out talking about what she went through, thinking about the future of women's sport, thinking about those who would come after her. When you think about Caster Semenya, she keeps talking about it, that she has achieved a lot, but she needs to do this for the next generation. When you think about Dutee Chand, even though she was just 18 years old at the time when she went to Court of Arbitration for Sport, she not only challenged her ban, but she also challenged the regulation itself, which would impact many girls and women across the world. So that idea kind of helped. There is that idea of making, of thinking beyond yourself when you see in each of these cases. Having said that, I do feel that I wish track and field athletes were more unionized. And I also feel that unionization has happened in certain parts of the world, in certain games, and not so much in many other games, and not so much in many parts of the world. And that is something that the unionization of sport lacks, and we probably need to look into. This is more so in case of women, where we haven't seen women coming together, creating unions as much in countries like India, where I come from. So there is a lot to do. And I'm sure that existing unions and, for example, FIFPro is doing excellent work. So I'm sure.
I'm going to mention FIFPro.
Yeah.
I mean, what they've done to take on, sexual abuse and harassment in women's football has been amazing. And these players aren't unionized yet, but they're not. But yet, the union has said, we will help you.
Yeah, I mean, there are two things here. One, when people come from outside and help athletes unionize or come together. On the other hand, athletes themselves may feel the need to create their own unions. It can happen both ways. In cases where it's tougher to create your own sort of union, I think it's so important for catalysts like FIFPro to get involved and do this work. And so it's an excellent example. Having said that, I believe that there's a lot that is to be done still. And I must say that when, for example, we were working on Dutee Chand's case or Caster Semenya's case, I did notice World Players Association got involved, wrote letters to World Athletics. But still, when it comes to unionizing athletes, especially from the global south, countries in the global south, where often rights of girls and women are way more, sort of threatened, we haven't yet sort of seen as much work. And this is something that I hope, with the work that the Center for Sport and Human Rights doing, with the emphasis on labor rights, I believe that this would go somewhere in future.
Well, and certainly, I mean, that's a nice mention of the center. I mean, one of the things that we feel is sacrosanct is freedom of expression, and that includes athletes, right? So athletes' ability to, have their voice and have it be heard. But besides that, it's, most people don't. And in sport, it's the same way. Don't realize that these human rights that everybody has, including labor rights, we have by virtue of we live and breathe, right? They're not bestowed on us because of a particular thing that we do or don't do. We have them. And I think, one of the things that I've learned coming from the world of sport into the world of human rights is realizing what we have. And it's also part of our work is to help those claim that which is theirs already, which is the agency around their own rights, including rights as workers, rights as athletes, rights as workers, what have you. But I'm wondering if we could pivot a little bit and talk about, from the workers' side, but into the gender gap sort of in other ways. And, I'd like to talk a little bit about gender gaps in sport. So there's a lot of unconscious bias and certainly the role that you have right now, and also your history beforehand. We've seen lots of it. So I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about, bias and what's it going to take to start to change the world of sport. I mean, it's a hard one.
It's a hard one, but each of us are doing our bit. I believe it's a difficult one, and I think from the Global Observatory side, what is key to change is being able to look at the knowledge gaps. Where are the knowledge gaps, and sort of get have that evidence. So what we are trying to do is get that evidence and then start engaging. And I think that's quite similar to some other organizations as well. But we would like to have evidence on issues of concern, and then start engaging, and then engaging in an inclusive way, hopefully, because it's a global organization, and the emphasis would be to include activists, advocates, experts, people in sport, stakeholders from across the world, which is a huge emphasis, especially because of the work that I have done, and I have seen the difference. I've seen the gap. I've seen how different the global South is from the global North. So it's very important for me to have evidence from across the board, from across the whole, whole world, and then engage with not only international federations but national governments as well, and eventually take collective action. So that is what we are aiming at in Global Observatory. We're looking at some thematic areas at this point that we would like to focus on and plan our initiatives accordingly. And of course, when we talk about women in sport, we would not only talk about athletes, even though athletes will be key and central to the work of the Global Observatory, but we would also like to talk about all women in sport. And when I say all women in sport, I talk about coaches, as I said, coaches, referees, sport journalists, to sport lawyers, to the medical staff who are women in sport. And it's also about sort of moving on from the idea of talking about girls and women to also talk about equality at large, and focusing on the gender lens, but intersectional gender lens. So ensuring that when we talk about girls and women, for example, we are talking about girls and women in all their diversity.
Absolutely. You mentioned, women in sport from all levels, and I couldn't agree more. As women have more opportunities in sport, we're going to have these incredible women in all their diversity matriculating from being an active athlete, coach, referee, what have you, into other things that they will do in sport. And what I love about seeing Emma Hayes, who's a pundit in the United Kingdom, right, as a pundit for the men's Euros, and she was fantastic. I mean, did a terrific job. I love seeing these women who've come from sport contributing in more and more impactful ways. And I have my own experience. You and I both have our own experience. In 2003, I was the first female member of senior management at FIFA, and I'm inside this place. And of course, there are many more since then, which is good. But, we'd be talking about a technical issue, right, involving the sport of football. And they'd immediately there'd be this bias that, well, she doesn't know what she's talking about because I'm an American accent and a woman. And they're like, oh, wait a minute. She won the World Cup, won the Olympics. Yeah, maybe actually we're not quite sure what to do with this, right? And it's this whole unconscious bias that comes in because the packaging is very clear. You're female, right? And so all this unconscious bias comes in, whereas the men who don't have a background, perhaps in the sport, none of that bias applies. I don't know if any of that made sense,
Yeah,
but that's
it
something
does.
that, I mean,
It does, and I think it gets more complicated when you have a brown woman
Yeah.
or a black woman doing this.
Sure.
So there are layers, and we can just keep talking about it. And so there are lots of unconscious bias, and we are at the everyday level dealing with it as we, as women. Now that I have had a whole career as an advocate, but at this point, trying to head an organization, it's a new learning for me. And obviously, it's sport has been an immense world, and how do you penetrate into it, and how do you establish yourself there? How do you survive as well? But you survive well is the question.
Well, and I think, in terms of looking at what's going to make a difference, right? So in many ways, as a sector, women have had a hard time in sport in terms of making it to the very senior levels. I mean, certainly FIFA has several women in very prominent positions, and this isn't just about, football, it's about all sport. But, there is still a lot of ground to be made with women being in more prominent roles in sport. What do you think are things that will start to really make a difference?
A few years back, as an activist, an advocate, I would have said just dismantle everything. I can't say that anymore. But I think conversations, endless and tireless conversations, has to happen. And if people are not listening, you keep knocking at the door. You keep knocking at the door, and that's what I did myself, even when I'm not as a woman only, but also as someone from the global south. We have often felt that it's so hard to penetrate into the world of sport, which is so centered in Europe and the global north. So what you do, you keep knocking at the door until you get to Lausanne one day. So so that I think that's the key, that you can never give up. You have to sort of tirelessly continue to knock at the door and have those conversations until one day they start listening. Having said that, as an activist, I've also realized there are moments when it's important to take action in the sense of go to the court. And if there is serious, discrimination, that needs to be taken to the court, that needs to, you will have to do that as well. There is a mechanism, and whether it be National Court of Law or be the Court of Arbitration for Sport, that is another way of ensuring that, that there is gender equality.
Well, it's interesting because I'm also a believer in increased diversity just drives performance. And I'm looking at, as as one of our trustees, bringing more diversity into the center in all of its forms. But also I do believe that more cognitive diversity in all forms, and that includes perspectives, lived experience, drives performance. I fundamentally believe that. And so what I hope is that by bringing in, and it can be through a hard measure like a quota or other ways, bringing in more of that diversity into and including of women, and women from all parts of the world, and all their colors and, languages and all of it. I do firmly believe that it drives performance, because better decisions, more, particularly if you're a global organization, you just have more lenses to bring things through. And so I hope, yeah.
Absolutely. I completely agree with you, Mary, and that. The thing is, this will happen one day. Things have changed, especially in the last decade or so. Things have moved, and we can be hopeful that things would change, and we'll see more women, more color, more diversity in these spaces of power, especially in the international federations and and the international bodies like the IOC.
Well, on that note, Payoshni, maybe one day, 20, 30 years from now, you and I can both sit back, or at least I'll be sitting back in a rocking chair probably, and looking back and hopefully seeing in the wake of so many women who've played an active role in our careers into making it possible for more women from all over the world to follow. So I hope that's the case. Thank you so much for giving us your time. And you can count on the center for all of our support for the observatory and for you and your new role. And we wish you nothing but the greatest success in this incredibly important organization.
Can I add something, Mary?
Of course. Yeah, we're rolling.
There was a quote from Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg, where she talks about writing for tomorrow. And I think all we are trying to do is write for tomorrow. When you were an athlete, you didn't really live what today's athletes are living, but you did do enough to see this day. And so, I guess the work that we do today is not for today, but for tomorrow. And I hope there is enough change in future.
Yeah, that's a wonderful way to end, and so important. And I think, when I think about when you work with athletes, and a powerful part of why they're going through what they're going through to be able to compete, it's also about what they're leaving behind for those who come after them tomorrow. And that's such a part, I think, of what a lot of women do in many ways, is how do I make it better for the women that will come after me? So
consciously
wonderful.
Or unconsciously?
Consciously or unconsciously. Maybe it's sort of hardwired in. Dr. Payoshni Mitra, can't thank you enough. Thank you for giving us your time. And we wish you nothing but the most success for the Global Observatory. We're rooting for you.
Thank you, Mary.